Thomas stared at the 3 crumpled bills in his wallet. 2 tens and a 5. $25 to last him until next Friday's paycheck. His hands trembled slightly as he closed the worn leather wallet, a hand-me-down from his father that had seen better days, just like everything else in his life. It was 10:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and he was standing in the employee parking lot of Morrison's warehouse, watching his breath form small clouds in the cold November air. The fluorescent lights from inside cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt. In 17 minutes, his shift would begin. Another 8 hours of loading boxes, scanning barcodes, and trying to stay awake while his body screamed for sleep. This had been his life for the past 4 years. Night shift, 5 days a week, sometimes 6 when he was desperate enough to take overtime. The pay was barely enough to cover rent for his studio apartment in the roughest part of town, instant noodles for most meals, and the bus fare to get to work. There was never anything left over. No savings, no emergency fund, just an endless cycle of work, exhaustion, and barely scraping by. Thomas pulled his thin jacket tighter against the wind and walked toward the entrance. Inside, the warehouse hummed with the sound of machinery and the constant beeping of forklifts. His co-workers were already gathering near the time clock, looking just as tired and defeated as he felt. "Yo, Thomas," called out Marcus, a heavy-set man in his 50s who had worked the night shift for over a decade. "You look like death, man. Rough day?" "Every day's rough, Marcus," Thomas replied, forcing a weak smile. "You know how it is." Marcus laughed, but there was no joy in it. "Yeah, I know exactly how it is. Been knowing for 15 years now." That comment hit Thomas harder than Marcus probably intended. 15 years. Would that be him in another decade? Still here, still broke, still going nowhere? The shift supervisor, a middle-aged woman named Janet with a permanent scowl, clapped her hands. "All right, everyone, listen up. We've got 3 trucks coming in tonight, and they all need to be unloaded and sorted by 4 a.m. Let's move." The next 6 hours blurred together in a haze of repetitive motion. Lift, scan, stack. Lift, scan, stack. Thomas's mind wandered as his body moved on autopilot. He thought about the community college brochure he'd picked up 3 months ago, still sitting unopened on his kitchen counter. He thought about his younger sister's wedding next year that he probably couldn't afford to attend. He thought about his mother's disappointed face the last time he'd visited, when she'd asked him when he was going to make something of himself. At 4:30 a.m., during his break, Thomas sat alone in the break room with a cup of terrible vending machine coffee. The room was empty except for him. Most of the other workers took their breaks earlier or later, but Thomas liked this time. The world felt suspended in these quiet hours before dawn, like he existed in a pocket outside of normal time. He was scrolling mindlessly through his phone when the break room door opened. A man walked in, someone Thomas had never seen before. He was probably in his late 50s, well dressed in a way that seemed completely out of place in the warehouse. He wore a crisp button-down shirt and slacks, and there was something about the way he carried himself that spoke of success and confidence. "Mind if I sit?" the man asked, gesturing to the chair across from Thomas. Thomas shrugged. "It's a free country." The man sat down and pulled out a thermos, pouring himself what looked and smelled like real quality coffee. He took a sip and sighed contentedly. "Nothing beats a good cup of coffee at this hour," he said. Thomas raised his styrofoam cup. "Yeah, well, some of us make do with what we can afford." The man studied him for a moment, his eyes sharp and assessing. "You work night shift here." 4 years running, Thomas said, unable to keep the bitterness out of his voice. "And how's that working out for you?" Thomas let out a harsh laugh. "What do you think? I'm drinking dollar coffee at 4:30 in the morning in a warehouse break room, living the dream." Instead of being offended, the man smiled. "I'm Richard Morrison," he said, extending his hand. Thomas shook it, confused. "Morrison? Like Morrison's Warehouse Morrison?" "My grandfather started his place 60 years ago," Richard said. "I run the company now, but I make it a point to visit our facilities at odd hours. Keeps me connected to what's really happening." Thomas felt his face flush with embarrassment. He'd just been sarcastic to the owner of the company. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to—" Richard waved him off. "Don't apologize. I asked an honest question. You gave an honest answer. That's refreshing." He leaned back in his chair. "Can I tell you something, Thomas?" "How do you know my name?" Your name tag, Richard pointed out with a slight smile. Listen, I see a lot of people in your position. Good people, hard-working people who feel stuck, and you want to know what the difference is between the ones who stay stuck and the ones who break free. Thomas felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, maybe, or just curiosity. What? The ones who break free wake up at 5 a.m. Thomas stared at him. That's it? That's your big secret? Wake up early? I know it sounds too simple, Richard said, but hear me out. You work until 6 a.m., right? Then what do? Go home, sleep until 2 or 3 in the afternoon, wake up, eat something, waste time until I have to come back here. Exactly. And that schedule is destroying any chance you have of improving your life. Richard leaned forward. But what if instead of sleeping all day, you went home, slept from 7 a.m. to noon, and then woke up at 5 a.m. the next day? That would give you 2 hours before work, 2 precious hours when the world is quiet, when your mind is fresh, when you can actually work on becoming someone different. I'd be exhausted, Thomas protested. You're already exhausted, Richard countered. But right now your exhaustion has no purpose. What I'm suggesting is that you use those 2 hours between 5 and 7 a.m. to invest in yourself. Learn a new skill, exercise, read, study. Do something, anything that moves you toward a better future. Thomas wanted to dismiss it as rich guy nonsense, but something in Richard's intensity made him listen. 20 years ago, Richard continued, I was managing this warehouse on the day shift, making barely more than you do now. I had a mountain of debt, a failing marriage, and no prospects. Then I met someone who told me the same thing I'm telling you now. Wake up at 5 a.m., use that time, change your life. And it worked. I spent 2 hours every morning for a year teaching myself business management and accounting. Got my certification. Within 3 years, I'd moved into corporate. Within 10, I was running the entire Eastern Division. Now I own the company. Richard pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. I'm not promising you'll own a company, but I promise that if you commit to waking up at 5 a.m. every single day for 90 days and using that time wisely, your life will transform. Thomas picked up the card, turning it over in his hands. Why are you telling me this? Because I see something in you, that look in your eyes. You're not defeated yet. You're angry, and anger is fuel if you use it right. Richard stood up. The question is, are you angry enough to actually do something about it? After Richard left, Thomas sat alone in the break room for the rest of his break, staring at the business card. Part of him wanted to throw it away, to dismiss this whole conversation as a random encounter that meant nothing. But another part of him, a part that had been dormant for so long he'd almost forgotten it existed, was whispering, what if? What if this was the answer he'd been searching for? What if waking up at 5 a.m. could really change everything? The shift supervisor's voice crackled over the intercom. Break's over, back to work. Thomas pocketed the business card and stood up. He had 2 more hours of his shift to go. 2 more hours to think about whether he had the courage to try. The alarm screamed at 4:45 a.m. Thomas's hand shot out from under the covers, fumbling across the nightstand until it found his phone and silenced the shrill beeping. For a moment, he lay there in the darkness of his studio apartment, every fibre of his being begging him to go back to sleep. He'd gotten home from his shift at 6:30 a.m., fallen into bed by 7:00, and now, less than 10 hours later, his body was in full rebellion against consciousness. His eyes felt like sandpaper. His limbs were heavy as concrete. The rational part of his brain was screaming that this was insane, that he needed rest, that he should sleep until noon like always. But he'd made a promise to himself. 3 days had passed since his conversation with Richard Morrison, 3 days of thinking, doubting, and ultimately deciding that he had nothing to lose. His life wasn't working. The definition of insanity was doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. If he wanted something different, he had to do something different. So here he was, forcing himself to sit up in bed at 4:47 a.m., his head pounding and his body protesting every movement. Thomas stood on shaky legs and stumbled to the bathroom. The face that stared back at him from the mirror looked terrible. Dark circles under bloodshot eyes, stubble that needed shaving, the face of a man running on fumes. "This is stupid," he muttered to his reflection. "You're going to kill yourself." But he splashed cold water on his face anyway. The shock of it jolted him slightly more awake. He brushed his teeth, changed into an old pair of sweatpants and a t-shirt, and looked at the clock, 4:52 a.m. He'd planned this out. Richard had been specific in his advice when Thomas had called the number on the business card 2 days ago. "Don't just wake up early and waste the time," Richard had said. "Have a plan. First 30 minutes, move your body, get the blood flowing. Next hour, learn something new. Last 30 minutes, plan your day and visualize your goals." Thomas had never exercised a day in his life beyond the physical labor of his job. He didn't own workout equipment. He didn't have a gym membership. But he did have a flaw in gravity. At 4:55 a.m., as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky outside his window, Thomas dropped to the floor and attempted his first push-up in years. He managed 3 before his arms gave out. "Pathetic," he gasped, lying flat on the worn carpet. But he got back up and tried again, 3 more. Then, after a minute's rest, 2 more. By the time 15 minutes had passed, he'd done a grand total of 20 push-ups, broken into painful sets, along with some attempted sit-ups and squats that left him breathless and sweating. It wasn't impressive. It wasn't even adequate. But it was something. It was more than he'd done yesterday. At 5:10 a.m., Thomas sat at his small kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee and his old laptop, a battered machine he'd bought used 3 years ago. Before his conversation with Richard, he'd been aimless, unsure what skill to pursue, but Richard had given him practical advice. "What does this warehouse need?" Richard had asked. "What skills would make you valuable?" Thomas had thought about it. Morrison's warehouse was expanding, going more digital. They needed people who understood inventory management systems, data analysis, basic programming for their logistics software. Most of the current employees, including management, were from the old school. They knew the physical work but struggled with technology. So Thomas had decided he would learn Excel, CQ, and basic data analytics. Skills that were in demand, skills that could get him promoted from the warehouse floor to an office, skills that could double or triple his salary. He'd found free online courses, YouTube tutorials, practice data sets. And now, at 5:10 in the morning, while the rest of the world slept, Thomas opened his first lesson on Excel fundamentals. The first morning was brutal. His eyes kept trying to close. His brain felt sluggish, struggling to absorb information about formulas and cell references. Twice he caught himself nodding off, his head dipping forward before jerking back up. But he pushed through. One video, then another, taking notes by hand because it helped him remember, practicing the examples, fumbling through the exercises, getting frustrated when he couldn't figure something out, but refusing to quit. At 6:40 a.m. he reviewed what he'd learned and planned his day. He had to sleep soon. His shift started at 10 p.m. But first, he took 5 minutes to sit quietly and visualize. He closed his eyes and imagined himself 6 months from now, a year from now. Not on the warehouse floor, but in an office. Not exhausted and broke, but energized and stable. Not stuck, but growing. It felt silly at first, this visualization exercise Richard had insisted on. But as Thomas sat there in the quiet of his apartment, with the morning sun now streaming through his window, he felt something shift inside him. A tiny spark of belief. Maybe, just maybe, this could work. He slept from 7 a.m. to 2 p.m., woke up groggy and disoriented, forced himself to eat something, and went to work that night feeling like he'd been hit by a truck. The second morning was worse. When the alarm went off at 4:45 a.m., Thomas actually cried. Not dramatic sobbing, just tears of pure exhaustion running down his face as he lay in bed, his body screaming at him to stop this madness. "I can't do this," he whispered into the darkness. "I can't." He thought about Richard Morrison, about that confident look in his eyes when he'd said, 90 days, commit to 90 days, 3 months, that's all. 90 mornings, he'd done one, only 89 to go. The thought was overwhelming, but he got up anyway, because what was the alternative? Go back to sleep and wake up at noon and continue the same life that was going nowhere. At least this suffering had a purpose. The push-ups were even harder on day 2. His muscles ached from yesterday's effort. He managed 15 total, less than before. The learning session felt like trying to read through fog, but he showed up. He did the work. Day 3 was slightly better. His body was still exhausted, but there was a rhythm forming. Alarm at 4:45. Up by 4:50. Exercise until 5:10. Learn until 6:40. Visualize and plan until 6:45. Sleep by 7. Wake at 2. Work at 10. Day 4, he managed 25 push-ups. Day 7, he completed his first full Excel course and could create a pivot table from scratch. Day 10, he woke up at 4:45 and realized he'd beaten the alarm by 2 minutes. His body was adjusting. But it wasn't linear progress. Day 12 was terrible. Day 15, he slept through his alarm and woke up at 7 a.m. filled with guilt and shame. He'd broken the streak. Thomas sat on the edge of his bed, head in his hands, feeling like a failure. But then he remembered something Richard had told him: you'll mess up, everyone does. The difference between success and failure isn't perfection, it's what you do after you fall. Do you stay down or do you get back up? The next morning, day 16, Thomas was up at 4:45 again. By day 20, something strange started happening. The warehouse workers began to notice a change in him. Marcus commented that he seemed different, more energized despite working the same brutal hours. You sleeping better or something? Marcus asked during a break. Thomas almost laughed. He was sleeping less than ever, but he was living more. Something like that, he replied. By day 30, Thomas had worked through 3 complete online courses. He could manipulate data in Excel with confidence. He understood basic SQL queries. He'd started learning Power BI for data visualization, and his morning exercise routine had expanded. He was now doing 50 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, and a 20-minute bodyweight circuit that left him energized rather than destroyed. The physical changes were noticeable. He'd lost 10 pounds. His clothes fit better. His face looked less puffy and exhausted. But the mental changes were even more dramatic. For the first time in years, Thomas felt like he had agency over his life. He wasn't just surviving, reacting to whatever came his way. He was building something. Every morning between 5 and 7 a.m., he was investing in a better future. On day 33, something happened that changed everything. Janet, the shift supervisor, called him into her office during his break. Thomas's heart sank. Was he in trouble? Had someone complained? "Thomas," she said, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, "I've been watching you the past few weeks. You seem different, more focused. I've also heard you know your way around computers pretty well." Thomas nodded cautiously. "I've been teaching myself some things. Excel, data analysis, that kind of stuff." Janet leaned back in her chair. "We're implementing a new inventory management system next month. Corporate wants someone from each facility to train on it and help roll it out to the rest of the staff. It would mean transitioning to day shift, working directly with the IT team, and a pay bump to $17 an hour. I'm supposed to recommend someone." She paused. "You interested?" Thomas felt his heart race. $17 an hour. Day shift. Working with technology instead of just boxes. This was exactly the kind of opportunity he'd been working toward, but he'd expected it to take months, maybe a year. "Yes," he managed to say. "Absolutely yes." "Good. You start training Monday. Don't make me regret this recommendation." After she dismissed him, Thomas walked back to the warehouse floor in a daze. Day 33. Just 33 days of waking up at 5 a.m., and already his life was changing. That morning, at 5 a.m. on day 34, Thomas's workout felt different. Every push-up was a celebration. Every minute of learning was validation that this was working. When he sat down to visualize his future, he didn't have to imagine as hard. He could feel it becoming real. He pulled out his phone and sent a text to Richard Morrison. "Got offered a promotion today. Day shift, working with the new system. I wanted to say thank you." The response came 3 minutes later. "I didn't do anything. You did the work. But here's the thing, Thomas. Don't stop now. This is just the beginning. Keep waking up at 5 a.m. Keep learning. Keep growing. The momentum you're building is more valuable than the promotion." Thomas read the message twice, then set his phone down and got back to his learning. Richard was right. This wasn't about one promotion. This was about becoming a different person, building a different life. The magic wasn't in the hour of 5 a.m. itself. The magic was in the choice, the daily choice to prioritize his future over his comfort, to invest in growth over sleep, to believe that he was worth the effort. By day 45, Thomas had transitioned to day shift. He was working 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., training on the new inventory system, and still waking up at 5 a.m. every morning. Now he had his evenings free for the first time in 4 years. He could see his friends. He could have a social life. But most evenings, he found himself back at his laptop, learning more, building more skills, momentum carrying him forward. Day 60, he'd completed a certification in SQL. Day 70, he'd built a dashboard in Power BI that impressed the IT team so much they asked if they could use it company-wide. Day 90 arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, 3 full months since that first brutal wake-up. Thomas sat at his kitchen table at 5:15 a.m., coffee in hand, and took stock of his transformation. He was 15 pounds lighter and in the best shape of his life. He'd completed 8 professional courses and earned 3 certifications. He'd been promoted and was now making nearly $3,000 a month instead of barely $2,000. He had $500 in savings, not much, but more than he'd ever had before. And perhaps most importantly, he felt different, confident, capable, alive. The 5 a.m. hour had become his favourite time of day. Not because it was easy, it still wasn't, but because it was his. In a world that constantly demanded things from him, these 2 hours were his to invest in himself. His phone buzzed. A message from Richard, day 90 today, right? How do you feel? Thomas thought about how to answer. How could he put into words the magnitude of what had changed? Finally he typed, like, I've been asleep my whole life and I'm finally waking up. Thank you for showing me the way. You ready for the real challenge now? Richard replied. Thomas smiled. What's that? Day 91 and 92 and every day after. The hard part isn't the 90-day challenge. The hard part is making it a lifetime habit. That's where most people fail. They hit their goal and then stop. Don't stop, Thomas. This is who you are now. Thomas looked at his calendar. He'd already scheduled his alarm for 4:45 a.m. tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, because Richard was right. This wasn't a 90-day experiment anymore. This was his life now. 1 year later, Thomas stood in front of a mirror in a hotel bathroom in downtown Chicago, adjusting his tie. He barely recognized the man staring back at him. Gone was the exhausted warehouse worker with hollow eyes and slumped shoulders. In his place stood someone who looked like he belonged in a corporate office. The physical transformation was obvious. He'd lost 30 pounds, his posture was straight, his eyes were clear, alert. But the real change went deeper than what any mirror could show. Today, Thomas was presenting to Morrison's executive team about the inventory optimization system he designed, a system that was projected to save the company over $2 million annually, a system that had caught the attention of Richard Morrison himself, who'd personally requested that Thomas present it to the board. It was 5:47 a.m. He'd been awake since 4:45 as always. Even here in the hotel, even with a major presentation ahead, he'd woken up early, done his workout in the hotel gym, and spent an hour reviewing his presentation materials. The routine was non-negotiable now, as essential as breathing. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Heard you're presenting to the big bosses today. Kill it, man. Some of us are rooting for you. Thomas smiled. Marcus was still on night shift at the warehouse. They'd kept in touch, and Thomas had tried several times to share what he'd learned, to convince Marcus to try the 5 a.m. routine. But Marcus always had an excuse. Too old, too tired, too set in his ways. Thomas understood. A year ago, he would have made the same excuses. The difference between him and Marcus wasn't talent or intelligence or luck. It was choice. Thomas had chosen to change. Marcus had chosen to stay comfortable. The presentation went better than Thomas could have imagined. The executives asked sharp questions, and he had sharp answers. They challenged his assumptions, and he defended them with data. By the end of the hour, Richard Morrison was smiling, and the CFO was already talking about implementation timelines. After the meeting, Richard pulled Thomas aside in the hallway. "Walk with me," he said. They took the elevator down to the hotel lobby and stepped outside into the crisp autumn morning. The city was just waking up, traffic beginning to build, people hurrying to their jobs. "You know what I see when I look at you?" Richard asked. "What?" "Proof. Proof that the system works. Proof that anyone can change their life if they're willing to wake up early and do the work." Richard stopped walking and turned to face him. "I want you to come work at corporate. Head of Operations Analytics, $75,000 a year to start, with performance bonuses. You'd be overseeing data systems across all our facilities." Thomas felt his breath catch. $75,000. Just 18 months ago, he'd been making $24,000 and thought that was all he'd ever be worth. "I don't know what to say," Thomas managed. "Say yes. And then promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you'll never stop waking up at 5 a.m. Promise me that no matter how successful you get, no matter how comfortable life becomes, you'll protect those morning hours. Because that's where your power is. That's where your future is built." Thomas nodded, emotion tightening his throat. "I promise." 6 months after taking the corporate position, Thomas was thriving. He'd moved into a nice apartment, bought his first car, and sent money home to his mother for the first time in his life. But more than the material changes, he discovered something profound about the compounding effect of daily discipline. Every single morning at 5 a.m., he was investing in himself. Some days he focused on advanced data science courses. Other days he read books on leadership and business strategy. Some mornings were dedicated to physical training. He'd run his first 10K race. Others were spent on creative projects, learning guitar, or writing in a journal. The specific activity mattered less than the consistency, because each morning built on the previous one. Each new skill connected to the others. Each day of growth made the next day's growth easier. He started documenting his journey on a blog, sharing his story and the principles that had transformed his life. To his surprise, people started reading. Hundreds, then thousands of people who were stuck like he'd been, looking for a way out. One email stood out. It was from a single mother working 2 jobs, barely making ends meet, who'd read his story and decided to try the 5 a.m. routine. 30 days in, she wrote to tell him she'd used her morning hours to complete a certification in medical coding. 60 days in, she'd gotten a new job that paid enough that she could quit her second job. 90 days in, she sent him a picture of her daughter's birthday party, the first one she'd been able to afford in years. "You changed my life," she wrote. "Thank you." But Thomas knew the truth. He hadn't changed her life. She'd changed her own life. He'd just shown her that it was possible. 2 years after his first 5 a.m. wake-up, Thomas received a call that brought everything full circle. "Thomas? This is Janet from the warehouse." He'd stayed in touch with his old supervisor, but her voice sounded different now, uncertain. "Janet, hey, what's going on? I need your help, or maybe just your advice." She paused. "I'm stuck. I've been a supervisor for 12 years, and I'm never going to move beyond this. I'm 53 years old, and I feel like my life is over. But then I remember what happened with you, how fast things changed once you started trying. And I thought, maybe it's not too late for me." Thomas felt a wave of emotion. Janet, who'd always seemed so tough and unapproachable, was asking him for help. "It's never too late," he said. "Tell me, what time do you wake up?" Over the next 90 days, Thomas became Janet's mentor, just as Richard had been his. He checked in with her every week. She sent him her progress reports. She struggled just like he had. She missed days. She doubted herself. But she kept going. On day 91, Janet called him with news. She'd been offered a regional management position. At 53, after spending her entire adult life feeling stuck, she was finally moving forward. "I can't believe it worked," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe that something so simple could change everything." "It's not the waking up early that changed everything," Thomas told her. It's what you did with those hours. You invested in yourself. You chose to grow instead of staying comfortable. That's what changed everything. 3 years after his transformation began, Thomas was invited back to Morrison's warehouse to speak to the night shift workers. He stood in the same break room where Richard Morrison had first approached him, looking at faces that mirrored his own from years ago. Tired, defeated, stuck. "I know what you're thinking," he began. "You're thinking this guy in the suit has no idea what your life is like. You're thinking he got lucky, or he had help, or he's special somehow. And you're right that I had help. A man named Richard Morrison gave me a piece of advice that changed my life. But I wasn't special. I was exactly where you are now, broke, exhausted, out of options." He told them his story, the crumpled bills in his wallet, the soul-crushing monotony of night shift, the moment Richard challenged him to wake up at 5 a.m. "I'm not going to lie to you," Thomas continued. "The first month was hell. I was more tired than I'd ever been. I cried. I wanted to quit every single day, but I kept showing up, and somewhere around day 30, something shifted. The exhaustion became energy. The discipline became freedom. The investment started paying dividends." He looked around the room, making eye contact with each person. "You all have the same 24 hours I do, the same 24 hours that Richard Morrison has, the same 24 hours that every successful person in history has had. The only difference is how you use them. And the hours between 5 and 7 a.m., those are magic hours. The world is quiet, your mind is fresh, there are no distractions. If you can claim those 2 hours every single day and invest them in becoming better, in learning something new, in building the skills you need for the life you want, everything changes." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I'm not promising it's easy, I'm promising it works, but only if you commit. Not for a week or a month, but for 90 days minimum, 90 days of waking up early, 90 days of doing the work, 90 days of choosing your future over your comfort. Can you do that?" The room was silent. Then from the back, someone raised their hand. "What if we fail? What if we try and can't keep it up?" Thomas smiled. "Then you start again the next day. Success isn't about perfection, it's about persistence. I missed days, I had terrible mornings where I learned nothing and accomplished nothing. But I kept coming back. That's the secret, you just keep showing up." After the talk, a young guy approached him. He couldn't have been more than 22, with the same look in his eyes that Thomas remembered from his own reflection years ago. "Did this really work?" the kid asked. "Or is this just some motivational BS?" Thomas pulled out his phone and showed him a photo. It was his old warehouse ID badge next to his current corporate ID. "That's me 3 years ago. 24,000 a year, no savings, no future. This is me now, 6-figure salary, leading a team of analysts, speaking at conferences around the country. The only thing that changed was I started waking up at 5 a.m. and using those hours to build a different life." He looked the kid in the eye. "But here's the thing. I can't make you believe it. You have to try it yourself. Set your alarm for 4:45 tomorrow, get up, do the work, then do it again the next day, and the next, for 90 days, then tell me if it's BS. The kid nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll try." "Don't try," Thomas said. "Do it, there's a difference." Now, at year 4 of his transformation, Thomas had become exactly what Richard Morrison had seen in him that night in the warehouse break room. Someone with potential. Someone who just needed a push in the right direction. He'd been promoted again, now serving as Morrison's VP of Innovation. He'd built a team of data, scientists and analysts, most of whom he'd recruited from the warehouse floors. People like him, who just needed an opportunity. He'd started a mentorship program, personally coaching 30 people through their own 90-day transformations. 23 of them had succeeded, moving into better positions and better lives. He'd also written a book about his experience, titled The 5 a.m. Revolution. It wasn't a bestseller, but it had found its audience, people who were desperate for change and willing to do what it took to achieve it. But the thing Thomas was most proud of wasn't the success or the money or the recognition. It was the routine. 4 years, over 1,400 consecutive days of waking up at 5 a.m. Through sickness and health, through easy times and hard times, through motivation and the lack of it, he'd kept the promise he made to himself and to Richard. Every morning those 2 hours were sacred. Some days he learned, some days he created, some days he planned. Some days he just sat in silence, drinking coffee and being grateful for how far he'd come. The discipline had become identity. He wasn't someone trying to wake up early. He was someone who wakes up at 5 a.m. It was as much a part of him as his name. On the 4-year anniversary of his first 5 a.m. wake-up, Richard Morrison invited Thomas to dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown. 4 years, Richard said, raising his glass. Most people can't commit to 4 days. You've built something remarkable, Thomas, not just a career but a life. I'm proud of you. I couldn't have done it without you, Thomas said. You gave me the roadmap. I gave you a suggestion. You did everything else. Richard set down his glass. Can I tell you why I approached you that night in the warehouse? I've always wondered. Because I saw myself in you, that same anger, that same desperation, that same spark of wanting more. I knew that if someone had just shown you the way, you'd run with it, and you did. Richard leaned forward. Now I want you to do something for me. Anything. I want you to promise me that you'll keep passing this forward. Keep finding people like you were, people who are stuck and angry and desperate. Show them the way. Because this isn't just about waking up early. It's about breaking the cycle of poverty and hopelessness. It's about showing people that they have power over their own lives, that they can change their destiny with daily discipline and consistent effort. Thomas nodded. I promise. It's already become my mission. Good, Richard smiled, because the world needs more stories like yours. Not to inspire people temporarily, but to give them a practical blueprint for change. Most motivational stuff is garbage. It makes people feel good for a day and then nothing changes. But what you did, that's real. That's repeatable. That's revolutionary. As Thomas drove home that night, he thought about the compound effect of those early mornings. The first 90 days had changed his job. The first year had changed his career. The first 2 years had changed his income. The first 3 years had changed his influence. And now, 4 years in, he changed his entire life trajectory. But the real magic wasn't in any single achievement. It was in the daily practice. It was in the choice, made fresh every morning when the alarm went off, to invest in himself rather than stay comfortable. He thought about the single mother who'd emailed him, about Janet who'd broken free at 53, about the kid from the warehouse who'd approached him after his talk, about the 23 people he'd mentored who were now living different lives. The 5 a.m. revolution wasn't about him. It was about everyone who decided to take control of their mornings and, by extension, their lives. When Thomas got home, he did what he always did before bed. He set his alarm for 4:45 a.m. He laid out his workout clothes. He prepared his coffee maker. He reviewed his goals for tomorrow's morning session. Because tomorrow morning, at 5 a.m., while most of the world was sleeping, he'd be awake. He'd be working. He'd be growing. He'd be building the next version of himself. And somewhere out there, someone else would be setting their alarm for 5 a.m. for the first time. Someone who was broke and tired and stuck, just like he'd been. Someone who was about to discover that the power to change their life had been inside them all along. They just needed to wake up early enough to use it. The cycle would continue. The revolution would spread. One early morning at a time, Thomas smiled as he climbed into bed. Tomorrow was day 1461 of his transformation. He couldn't wait to see what he'd build.